see, get my ducks in a row here. There we go. All right. So first we're going to kind of define resentment. I think most of us have a pretty good idea of what it is, but I'm just going to go ahead and put it out before we get going. So the feeling of resentment is a multi-layered and intense emotion that includes things like anger, bitterness, indignation, sadness, humiliation, and shame attached to it. And this is a definition given to us by therapist Christina Ebola Awason, I believe is how you pronounce their name. So in general terms, it just means that this feeling can arise when a person feels like they've been treated unfairly or in a way that is devaluing, disrespectful, or dismissing their identity or perspective. So just like any emotion, it's not stagnant. There's a range or a spectrum, typically stretching to whatever magnitude feels matched to that of the insult that prompted it, okay? So resentment, again, is not a pure emotion, but it is a particular manifestation of anger. And I know anger is one of those emotions that kind of gets a bad rap, right? Oftentimes when people feel anger, it's a very explosive emotion. There's not a lot of restraint. And so anger gets a bad rap. But I do believe that every emotion serves a purpose. Therefore, there's no such thing as a bad emotion. There's just maybe ways that we don't express that emotion that are the most healthy or beneficial for ourselves and those around us, right? So the word anger, or the feeling anger, can be very uncomfortable for people to admit that they feel, or even acknowledge that that's what they're feeling, right? And so I want to kind of get comfortable with the idea of anger being perfectly normal, natural, and human, okay? So if you feel resentment, if you're feeling anger, if you're feeling frustrated or devalued or dismissed, please know that at least in this space, it's a perfectly normal response to a probably abnormal situation that you're in, right? So resentment is persistent anger that builds up when there's no outlet for feeling frustrated or hurt, okay? So a lot of people who are in caregiving roles will experience resentment because there is no way for them really to express or have an outlet for the anger that they're feeling. Especially if the anger is maybe towards the situation that you're in and not maybe towards a person. And there's really not a lot you can change about the situation you're in. And so over time, that anger shifts into resentment. But I want to be very clear here that feeling anger and resentful doesn't mean that you do not love the person you're caring for, okay? And it doesn't mean that you're a rotten caregiver, okay? And it doesn't mean that you're a terrible person, okay? What does it mean? It means you're a human being, okay? We all feel something akin to resentment at least once in our lives, right? So even if you're not currently experiencing resentment, I'm sure that you can dig back into just your human experience and understand what it feels like, right? We can all kind of pinpoint a point in our lives where our anger had nowhere to go and it just kind of built up, right? So what causes caregiver resentment? Many things can cause the feeling of resentment, okay? It's a very complex emotion, and so it has very complex origins. But resentment typically happens when you feel like you've been taken advantage of, or you've been mistreated, or you aren't being heard, okay? And I know I've been talking with caregivers for several years now, and it comes up over and over and over again where it's not necessarily even the work that bothers them as much, but the lack of participation in the work from the people in their space, right? Siblings, other family members, right? That could be stepping up to alleviate some of the stress, some of the pressure, and share the load, and they aren't. And that's typically where a lot of that feeling of being taken advantage of or being mistreated can come from, or not even being heard. If you think about too, if you're navigating a very complex and under-resourced medical landscape, it's really difficult to try to advocate for yourself in a space that seems almost and capable of hearing you, right? And so we can feel resentment towards systems as well. Resentment is often defined, again, as a feeling of indignation. And unfortunately, resentment can unleash other destructive thoughts and emotions. And it can ultimately poison relationships if it's left unchecked. Okay. So this little caption on the cartoon that I have here is a lady laying on the couch speaking to her therapist. And she says, I tried to develop an attitude of gratitude, but the best I could muster was a sentiment of resentment, right? And it can be kind of like salt in the wound when you're feeling these feelings and someone just says, well, try to be grateful, right? Not that there's anything wrong with that advice, not that there's anything wrong with having a gratitude practice. I advocate for that kind of stuff all the time. But we can't just blanket over these intense and complex emotions with positive thinking in a lot of ways. We can definitely utilize positive thinking, but it's not going to fix everything, right? So we'll go through some of these causes together. One, again, feeling overwhelmed or invisible, right? And I think most of you, at some point in your journey, if not continuously, have felt overwhelmed and invisible, right? Being exhausted and unfulfilled, right? Where the task list is never done, where you have to make sacrifices in your own day-to-day life, in your own sense of identity in order to fulfill the role of a caregiver, right? Resentment can come from giving up jobs or putting other relationships and your own well-being on the back burner, right? These are very common sacrifices that caregivers are expected to make, right? And you're often expected to make those sacrifices without feeling frustration or anger or resentment, right? And it can sprout from one too many things going wrong, right? Challenging family dynamics, your loved one's care needs increasing or becoming more difficult, or being in a completely different realm than what you're used to doing, right? A lot of you are doing medical things, you're doing like nurse level care, and you don't have the degree or the training to do the job. I mean, obviously you're capable, but like most of you are not professional medical personnel, right? But you have to learn some of these skills to take care of your loved one, and that can cause a lot of challenges, right? It can be challenging to feel confident doing some of these things that are not familiar to you. Let's see. There can also be resentment due to inaction of others and not necessarily your care recipient, right? Maybe the person you're caring for doesn't impact you at all in this capacity, right? But it could be all the other players involved or not involved that can be causing this resentment, right? You might be feeling jealousy because maybe some of your siblings or some of your friends get to go out and live lives that are much different than yours because they don't have the additional responsibility of caregiving, right? Maybe you have a brother in another state who's, moving on as if nothing is taking place with mom and dad, and here you are in a situation that's going on maybe a decade or longer, and you've had to put your life on hold while other people have been able to move forward, right? There can be a lot of that jealousy that creeps up. Maybe even a sense of betrayal can come up, right? Embarrassment. Sometimes you have a loved one who their expressions or their behaviors in public can be embarrassing, even though you understand where it's coming from and they can't help it, but that's just the reality you're in, right? Shame, trauma, sharing your needs and not having them met. So this can be a really tricky one as well, right? When we say, hey, advocate for yourself, speak your needs, and then you do, and yet nothing changes, right? That right there is I think that's a quick run to resentment, right? Or not sharing your needs and not having them met, right? Or that can kind of create a sense of feeling entitled or believing that they should be met. And so if you have a feeling that they should be met and they're not met, that's where resentment comes in too, right? Because it feels like a boundary has been crossed or you're being ignored or not heard. Communicating boundaries and having them violated can cause resentment, and not identifying and setting your boundaries and having them violated. So sometimes we have boundaries that we don't tell other people we have, right? And so when they're continuously crossed, we don't speak up for ourselves, we don't advocate. And so that resentment can build, right? You're not okay with what's happening, but you've done nothing to stop it. No one's been made aware of that boundary. And so you just kind of swallow it down. And that could come from a myriad of reasons, right? Maybe you've kind of developed a personality trait where you're a people pleaser. And so you don't want people to feel uncomfortable or put out or get angry with you because you make a request, right? And then finally, hoping someone will read your mind and then becoming resentful and upset that they do not. Okay. So again, this isn't to blame you for feeling resentful, but this is just to show you that some of these things are recipes for resentment, right? So we want to make sure that we are advocating for ourselves as best as we can. So it's tricky to recognize the signs of resentment. It's because it's multi-layered, right? And it can combine many different feelings at the same time. And so whenever you're dealing with an emotion that's not, a basic emotion like, sad, happy, angry, and you're looking into more of these nuanced, complex emotions, it can be hard to find the right words. But overall, a resentful person ultimately feels like they've been wronged in some way, okay? They may be tense when they're around the person that they believe wronged them, right? Maybe you have a family member that anytime they come around, you do your best to avoid them. You can be someone who avoids conflict with that person. You might ruminate obsessively and not be able to stop thinking about an incident or an interaction. Maybe you talk badly about the person behind their back, right? That could be a sign of resentment. Refusing to admit that you're upset or talk about the situation at all, right? So you are feeling these feelings, but you're refusing to address it or you're refusing to talk about it. And another sign of resentment is pulling away emotionally and physically from the person that you feel resentment toward. So that could be your care recipient, right? Maybe you're resentful that they got sick, right? Even though logically you know they didn't do it on purpose, you could still be resentful, and that can be impacting how emotionally or physically close you are to that person, right? So maybe you're checking off the boxes, but you're not really providing care in a way that you would if you didn't have this kind of bubbling under the surface, right? So some feelings that contribute to or may indicate resentment: sadness, disappointment, frustration, hostility, hard feelings, and anger. Maybe you're feeling bitter. Maybe there's some fear in there somewhere. Blame, so that's for yourself or blaming other people. Feeling guilty can be a sign of resentment too, right? Feeling less than or not enough. And again, some of these feelings are kind of like ambivalent, right? It's like I'm both and. It's like I feel guilty that I'm not doing more, but I also feel frustrated that I have to do more, right? And maybe there's some regret or some imbalance in relationships, okay? Now, sitting with this, especially if you recognize yourself in it, can be very, very uncomfortable, and that's okay. All right. Most of us are not comfortable in resentment, and we're not comfortable in anger and frustration and disappointment, right? And that's okay. That's a good thing because again, our feelings are just information. Okay. It's data, it's signals. So if you don't feel comfortable in this, that's a motivation for you to shift, to change it so that you can feel comfortable, so that you can alleviate some of this pressure under the surface. So let's identify some triggers, okay? It's going to be different for everybody, but again, this is where self-awareness can really be our best friend in a lot of these cases, right? We know we're feeling something, we don't know why necessarily, we're not sure what sets us off, but we know it's there. So we want to get curious, right? We want to start looking around and finding what's actually building this up, what's creating this issue within us, okay? So to identify the source of your resentment, consider how your needs may have been written off or gone unmet in relationships, right? Or just in systems, right, that you're navigating. So if you're constantly giving to another person without feeling as though it's reciprocated, resentment can kind of brood under the surface very sneakily, right? So you might not feel resentful in the beginning, but you start to feel like you're always sacrificing or always compromising to that other person. These feelings can emerge. Now, if you think about this within the context of caregiving, it's always going to be imbalanced, right? Your loved one is not going to be in a position where they can reciprocate, tit for tat, right? 50-50. And we know this, that's okay. But that doesn't mean that feelings of resentment are not going to surface at some point or can't surface, right? We're not immune to this. When any human being is depleted or in an imbalanced relationship, there's going to be conditions for some of these feelings to come up. Okay. It might not be resentment proper, but it can be things like frustration, depletion, anger, right? So if you've expressed your concerns and the other people in your care circle have ignored them, resentment, as opposed to occasional anger or annoyance, builds up. Okay. So when you're feeling like your needs haven't been met, but then you believe that maybe if I speak up, they will be met and then they're not, that's a double whammy, right? And so at some point, you just kind of get tired of saying the same thing over and over again and it falling on deaf ears. And so that again is another layer of that disappointment, that frustration that turns into resentment. Kind of think of it like, I use the image here is the Grand Canyon, and the reason why is because the Grand Canyon, as we know, for many reasons why it developed, but it's that water erosion over time, right? So it's that slow, consistent trickle that just wears it down and down and down, and that's kind of what resentment is, right? It's this slow, unrelenting trickle grating against our nerves that's unaddressed, and eventually it erodes a lot of our relationships because of it, right? So if you are in this space and you're not comfortable with it, you're not alone, okay? Resentment builds when we have been clear and consistent in expressing what we need and it's being ignored. And again, this could be by individuals, this could be by systems, doctors, social workers, things like that, insurance companies, right? I know that's a big one for a lot of you. So that definitely can be a trigger. It can be environmental, right? And it's important to recognize that resentment is a normal reaction to taking on additional caregiving responsibilities. Okay. And this can happen very covertly for those of you who are caring for people whose needs increase over time. So maybe within the first year or two, there wasn't a whole lot of that resentment because it was manageable. But then as your loved one's needs increased and the weight on your shoulders increased and the imbalance in your system increased, resentment can sneak in and you might not even realize that that's what you're feeling. Okay. So again, if left unchecked, resentment can become destructive and impact everyone in very damaging ways. So this is why it's very important to identify it and address it before it spirals out of control. Okay. And please keep this in mind. Even the most compassionate people who are caregivers experience frustration, anger, because they're part of the caregiving experience. Okay. So you are not abnormal. You are not wrong. You are not strange. You're not bad if these are feelings that you experience. Okay. This is a very normal part of caregiving. Okay. So here's some questions you can ask yourself. Okay. If you think about, if we've gone through these few slides and you say, yeah, I think I am feeling some kind of anger. I am feeling some kind of imbalance. I am feeling maybe some resentment here. Think about maybe the last time that you felt that feeling in real time. And just to yourself, ask yourself these questions, okay? What was the triggering situation, right? was maybe you asked somebody to come and sit with your loved one for an hour and a half while you took a shower and they said no, right? And then think to yourself, what thoughts and emotions were involved? Were you feeling overlooked? Were you feeling pushed to the side? Were you feeling disregarded? And then ask yourself, how did you react, right? Most of us, resentment builds up in us not because we directly address triggering situations and the thoughts and feelings that were involved, right? They typically happen because something happened, we felt a feeling, and we kept it to ourselves. So think about that. How did you react? Did you swallow it down? Did you just kind of keep moving as if it didn't bother you when it really did? And in that time, think to yourself, where were you physically? Were you hungry? Were you tired? Were you in pain? A lot of you experience chronic pain as a direct result of your caregiving because you're having to do a lot of lifting and bending and bathing and changing, and oftentimes to full-grown bodies, which can be very taxing on your body. How full was your cup before you poured from it, right? It's very easy to get thrown off balance when we haven't created a sense of homeostasis within ourselves and cared for our own needs, right? And then think, what was the outcome, right? Did I yell? Did I slam something? Did I hang up the phone on somebody in mid-sentence, right? Did I react in a way that I'm not proud of? And then finally, can you show yourself some compassion? That one can be hard, right? I shouldn't have acted that way. I shouldn't have responded, or I should have said something and I didn't. I didn't stick up for myself, right? And when you don't allow yourself compassion, what happens? Shame creeps in. And shame will only compound our negative emotions even more, right? So now not only are we angry or embarrassed, right? Or not only are we angry and frustrated, but now we're embarrassed and we're ashamed. And that makes us feel 10 times worse. And then for those of you who are people pleasers, then you shift over to the other side of the spectrum and you try to make it better, right? And all the while ignoring the real problem, which is your needs were not being met, right? So resentment does have a very intense effect on the brain. So when I use the word ruminating, many of you know what that means, but for those of you who don't, it's kind of like when you get like a sticky thought, right? Where you get like a worry or a negative cognition, a negative thought, and you can't shake it, right? It just spins and spins and spins in your mind. So that's what ruminating is. We can ruminate over the feeling of resentment and the interaction that brought it on. And this floods the brain with stress hormones. Okay. So it's like a chain reaction. And those stress hormones can make you more susceptible to negative thoughts. And this thought process then paradoxically makes it more difficult to concentrate and identify effective ways to resolve the situation, right? So what's the result of that? Even more bitterness. So it's kind of this cycle that we find ourselves in, and we don't even realize we're in it, right? We just know we're not happy, and we know we're exhausted, and we know we're kind of fed up, right? So how do we avoid resentment, right? I want to say something that might be kind of radical for some of you, okay? Allowing yourself the space to get angry is a form of self-care. Now, what do I mean by that? Please do not misunderstand me. I'm not saying go out there and rage on anybody who's in your path, okay? Don't say, well, I was on a training and Jenny said it's healthy for me to be mad, so I'm going to go and cuss out my sister, okay? That's not what I'm saying. But chronic anger and resentment have been linked to a lot of health issues like migraines, sleeping disorders, eating disorders, even digestive tract disorders, right? High blood pressure, heart attacks, heart disease. So the long-term buildup of negative emotions can lead to mental health issues as well, like depression and anxiety, isolation and loneliness. So we need to understand that our anger is not a shameful emotion, but it can lead us to do some shameful things. And so we want to make sure that we accept our anger and we find spaces to express that anger in ways that are not going to come back and bite us later, right? We're not throwing glasses and punching doors, right? So I want you to think of the emotions as energy in motion, okay? And a lot of us in the United States, especially those of us in female bodies, we're often socialized to suppress things like anger, right? Um, and we're not supposed to prioritize our need for experiences that bring us pleasure, right? A lot of our culture is based on how far can you go without any assistance, right? How hard can you work without asking for a break, right? That's kind of how we built our culture. But that's not how our bodies work, right? We need to have time where we can allow ourselves to feel our feelings and have pleasurable experiences, things that bring us delight, okay? So, how do we accept our anger and let it flow? We can verbalize it, okay? Try talking to a trusted friend, join a support group, or even get the assistance from a counselor or a therapist. And if nothing else, you can journal, right? Sometimes our emotions just need a place to land. And so if you want to journal it out, write all the words that you want to say, and nobody will see it, okay? Some people like to write things out and burn the paper, right? I have a friend who will write out text messages and then immediately delete them. And why does this work? Again, energy and motion. That's what our emotions are. So if we don't release them in some way, they stay within our system and they lead to a lot of those consequences we spoke about in the last slide, right? Next, delay. So the greatest remedy for anger is delay. So how do we delay our anger? Because it's a very potent and explosive reaction or emotion, right? So we can do things like breathing exercises, taking a time out, maybe even having a personal mantra that we say when we start to feel that feeling creep up. And this is why emotional intelligence can be such a useful tool for us because we can understand when our bodies start to react, we can translate it. Okay, I'm getting angry. I'm feeling disrespected. And I can tell because now my mouth is dry and my hands are kind of clammy and I can feel my breath getting shallow, right? Your body's telling you how you feel. But oftentimes we're taught to ignore it. And so we don't realize we're getting angry. And so we don't have that time to step away and let it kind of, you know, translate itself a little bit, right? So we just kind of go for it, just kind of punch out that reaction. Venting it out. So sometimes it's not about talking and it's not about breathing. Sometimes we just need to physically get it out, okay? Exercise, walking around the block, singing or dancing, okay? And I know one of my tips on the slide here says a physical release like screaming into a pillow or punching a pillow. Some people find that helpful. Other people find it it kind of exacerbates what they're feeling. So just be mindful that that might work for you and it might not work for you, okay? But there are things that you can do physically. Why? Because when you're angry, when you're feeling that tension kind of build up, um, we're getting a lot of our stress hormones. So adrenaline, cortisol, those things can be pumping through our system. And so physical movement actually helps kind of release that. It kind of completes that circuit, okay? So movement can be very, very helpful. So how do we manage our resentment, or how are some ways that we can possibly dilute some of these feelings, okay? Excuse me. My favorite, develop self-compassion. It sounds easy, but if any of you have tried it, you realize it's definitely a skill we have to learn, right? There's a quote, and I can't remember, I think it might have been someone named Jack Cornfield. It said, if your compassion practice does not include yourself, it's incomplete. And often caregivers have all the compassion in the world for everybody else, but you do not have one drop for yourself, right? You judge yourself more harshly than you judge other people. Your expectations for yourself are perfection or nothing, right? Perfection or bust. Everyone else can make mistakes but you, right? So, and if we make a mistake, it's it could potentially be the end of the world, right? And I understand that because some of you are caring for people who have very high medical needs, right? They can be medically fragile. And so the weight of a mistake, is more costly than maybe other people's mistakes. And I understand that. That's very true. Even so, self-compassion is a must, okay? So being resentful as a coping mechanism may have worked in the short term, right? But be kind to yourself. You're human and you can make mistakes, right? So we don't want to beat ourselves up and we don't want to keep quiet when we have needs, right? Next, view the situation with empathy, okay? If you have a person in your life who is maybe bumping up against this feeling of resentment all the time, right? There may be some real reasons why they cannot participate in care the way that you do. Okay. Some of you are not in that situation. Some of you have people that aren't participating because they just literally don't want to, right? And that's a whole nother story. But there are some people who can't participate, right? And another thing, if you're feeling resentment towards your care recipient, right? We know that they can't help the situation they're in, right? And so we can approach that with a lot of empathy too, okay? And understanding where somebody's coming from doesn't fix everything, but again, it can help you manage those feelings so they don't turn into resentment, okay? Forgiving yourself and others. So although it may be difficult to let go of resentment, making peace with what happens can increase your sense of well-being and your sense of purpose in life. Reflect and identify the source of the resentment. We talked about this already a little bit, right? But if it's something that you can address through clear and courageous communication, practice doing so, right? Practice communicating your needs and your boundaries. And if the resentment is stemming from a situation that's out of your control, acknowledge the feelings arising from you, right? And that could be things like grief or rage. And then we can practice acceptance and focus on what we can control once the feelings have been processed. We can embrace a new perspective. So it can be really tough to figure out how to let go of resentment when you're too deep in it, right? So we can try reframing our thoughts from the perspective of an outside party, maybe even mediating a situation, right? Between you and your resentment. So this is where a counselor or a therapist can come into play, or a trusted friend, right? And maybe you can even personify your resentment in a way and ask the resentment what it's trying to show you, right? And that might sound kind of silly, but again, emotions are data and they're trying to tell us something. They're telling us that something is creating an imbalance internally, right? So we can sit with that resentment. What are you trying to tell me? Am I pushing too hard without rest? Am I expecting more from people than they're able to give, right? Have I not truly accepted my place in this scenario? Get curious. Curiosity, I think, again, is one of our most overlooked tools when it comes to emotional regulation, right? We don't want to be curious about why we feel what we feel. We just don't want to feel that way anymore, right? And exploring the softer emotions of resentment. Okay, so of course, resentment can often show up as anger, right? Outwardly, you're upset of people maybe constantly failing to do things that you need them or to, or you're angry because of the situation you're in. But softer emotions like fear, right? Fear of having your needs going unmet. This can often be at the root of the issue, right? And so we can stop learning to project fear as anger, and this can help bring us to a better sense of peace within us, right? Anger is one of those things that in a therapy world, we call it a secondary emotion a lot of the times. And it might feel like anger just, that's what you're feeling, right? That's the first thing you feel. But there's often a split second before the anger shows up where the true emotion is present, right? And that could be fear, it could be grief, it can be shame, right? It can be all these softer emotions. And then anger shows up to kind of protect us, because for a lot of us, it's much easier and less complicated to feel angry about something and process through that than it is to experience and accept that we're feeling shame or that we're feeling grief, right? Those are harder emotions to process. And so anger kind of shows up as a way to protect us, even though it's not really at all, right? But again, be curious, investigate, right? What are those softer emotions that are making me feel this resentment, right? And for those of you caring for people who have a chronic illness where, the end of your caregiving journey is going to be when that person passes. And that's a very, very heavy feeling to feel. And it can be very hard to walk through that grief, especially if the person you're caring for is still alive, right? So anger can show up as a way to kind of help mitigate the pain of the grief that we're feeling. It's very complex, but our brains do these things automatically often, and we don't notice it until we make ourselves intentionally stop and notice it. Okay. So we just have a few more slides. We've talked about some of the sources, some of the potential triggers, maybe even some ways to mitigate that. But I want to share something that has worked for me. Okay. I am somebody who, for many different reasons in my life, have experienced anger and resentment and betrayal, right? And it can leave you feeling very, very bitter. And for me, bitterness is, a nail in the coffin for me. I cannot operate as a bitter Betty and be my best self. So you don't have to do this, but this is just an example from my life. And it's called the loving kindness practice, or it's also known as a metta meditation. So this is where you just recite positive phrases first with yourself. Okay, so this is a good way to begin a self-compassion practice and just get used to turning that compassion inward. Okay, so we start with ourselves and then we move out to other people. And I'll go through this with you. But the practice aims to foster a mental state of kindness, love, and compassion. And if we do this regularly, this actually kind of builds this up in our brains and our nervous system. And it starts to become more of a normal, instinctual kind of reflex or reactive response. Or, yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. So it can kind of help mitigate some of those negative emotions. So it's very simple. You just start with yourself and you say this: may I be safe. May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I live in peace. May my heart fill with love. And may my whole being fill with kindness. Now, this isn't like a magic spell, right? You don't have to say these words exactly. But again, it's just kind of giving you a framework of how can you bring some loving kindness and some compassion back to yourself. And this may be the most challenging part for some of you, right? And this might be where you start, and this may be where you stay for a while. And that's okay. The next layer, okay? We want to extend this out to other people. So you start with yourself: may I be happy, may I be healthy, right? And then you think about somebody that you care about, right? Somebody who's easy to love. Maybe this is a spouse or a child or a pet or a neighbor, right? And you fill in the blanks and you say, and I'll use my husband's name as an example: may Brian be safe. May Brian be happy. May Brian be healthy, right? And go through. And that's easy, right? It's easy to say that about this person. But then I want you to think the next layer, right? Maybe somebody that you feel kind of neutral about, right? Maybe you don't have any feelings one way or another about this person, right? It could be your neighbors or maybe coworkers you don't interact with a lot, or the worker at the grocery store, right? And you go through it again. May they be safe. May they be happy. May they live in peace, right? And then you go out again, maybe to people that you don't really like. Now, can be, Definitely more challenging for some of us, right? But again, it's kind of like when you're at the gym, right? Or you're working out and you want to push yourself a little bit further. And so you start doing more weights or more reps, right? So this is kind of like that expansion of what's comfortable for you. And you think about that person who maybe you don't like very much, or maybe you're feeling a little resentment towards, or maybe you're a little bitter towards. And you say this about them. May they be safe. May they be happy. May they be healthy. And then the last layer is where you include all things, all people, all beings, right? May all living things be safe. May all living things be happy. Okay. If you start this practice, I'm not going to make any guarantees. Okay. But research shows that these types of practices done regularly do decrease a lot of the quote unquote negative feelings that we feel about ourselves and other people. Okay. But remember, it's a practice. Okay. This isn't a one and done magic pill. Okay. This is something that you have to do with intention. And what this does is it wires our brains towards into the direction of kindness and compassion. Okay. Because our brains will constantly revisit what we allow it to land on. Okay. And even though we as human beings are kind of wired with this negativity bias, right, where we're kind of always scanning our environment for potential harm, and we're going to see the negative before we see the positive. That's just a very basic instinct that we have. But over time, if we're only focusing on negative things, that's all we're going to see, right? That's what our brain is going to bring to the foreground. So these kind of practices over time, it reorients your attention from the quote unquote negative things in your environment to the more positive things in your environment. Okay. This is why a gratitude practice can be helpful. Again, it's not a magic pill, it's not a magic spell, but it's reorienting the neural pathways to focus on positives other than our natural negativity bias. Okay. Now, I will say, I'm not saying to blanket hard things with positive things and act like it doesn't hurt. Okay. I'm actually advocating for the opposite. We want to acknowledge when things hurt. We want to acknowledge when things are uncomfortable. And then we want to sit with it and show ourselves compassion as we metabolize it. Okay. Talking to people helps. Okay. Now, I put the National Suicide Hotline up here, 988. A lot of times when people see that, they kind of bristle. You know, I'm not there yet. I'm not suicidal. I would never do that. Okay. And I understand. I used to work this hotline for years. Not everybody who calls is actively suicidal. Oftentimes people call because they're feeling all these other feelings, right? They're feeling isolated. They're feeling disoriented. They're feeling confused about their own emotions. So they call this hotline. You can also call the Crisis Services Helpline. This is North Alabama, but you can call it from anywhere in the state. And this isn't necessarily a suicide hotline, okay? This could just be you reaching out to a trained person. You typically they're volunteers, and just have somebody to talk to, right? Have a place for these feelings to land. Because again, if they get in our minds and they get sticky, they start to build and build and build. That can be more damaging to us than if we were to just reach out and call and talk to a stranger, okay? And I will say this, I've worked this helpline and I have people call me for all kinds of reasons, okay? I had one lady who would call probably every week. She lived in a nursing home and she didn't have any friends. And so she would call me and perform all the songs that she's written, right? She'd sing songs to me over the phone. And it wasn't necessarily quote unquote a crisis, you know, of what we would normally think a crisis would be. But it was somebody who needed another person on the other end to acknowledge what they were experiencing. Okay. So you can call these lines even if you're not suicidal, even if you're not, you know, actively in danger of hurting yourself, but you just need some human support. Okay. And a lot of times with it being anonymous, it kind of helps release some of that too. Okay. And then finally, I put my office number on here. Okay. I'm a therapist. I'm professionally, in that position. So if you want to have therapy, if you want to have some mental health services, we do offer them for free for caregivers throughout the state of Alabama. But if you're not in that space, you don't want therapy, you don't want counseling, but you just need somebody to talk to, I also offer care chats, which is just about 30 to 45 minutes of conversation, normalize what you're feeling, maybe give you a space to kind of decompress or let some of that steam out of the pressure cooker so that you don't, release it on somebody in an unhealthy way, right? So you can always reach out. And again, friends, family, church members, people that you already know and trust, they want to support you, right? But oftentimes as caregivers, we don't let them know how. People say, well, what do you need? How can I help? Oh, I'm fine. I've got it. When you're, neck deep in the sludge and you can't find your footing, but you'll say you're okay, right? We've all been there. So what are the takeaways of this presentation? First and foremost, anger is a normal and natural response to the demands of caregiving. Okay. What we do with that anger is very important, but feeling that feeling does not make us less than or make us terrible or bad people. Okay. It's a normal response to the demands of caregiving. Because if you think about it, what is caregiving, right? It's going to be an imbalance where you are giving more than you're getting. That's just the nature of the work. And that is that is a recipe for anger and resentment, okay? Next, anger that is not released in healthy ways turns into resentment over time. So it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, okay? And shaming ourselves compounds these difficult emotions and only makes them worse, okay? And I'm sure if you've been in caregiving for any amount of time, you know this all too well. And finally, the takeaway I want you to leave with is we can develop healthy strategies to help us cultivate emotional resilience, okay? One of the easiest ways to lose our cool is to ignore our feelings because they will inevitably surface, okay? But we can have control over that if we address the feelings and we find constructive ways to process through them. All right, that's my info for today. This is my email address, jstang@ucphuntsville.org, and my office phone number. So if you want to reach out, here's how you do it. I do not work on Wednesdays, so if you call or send me an email and I don't respond, I will get it back to you as soon as I'm back in the office, okay? So I'll stop my share and the